Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flock Talk. I'm Erin Morgan,
And I'm Jordan Sloggett.
and we work for the farmer members of the Ontario Sheep Farmers Organization.
This week, we're excited to have Andrew Rushmere, the interim executive director of Farmers for Climate Solutions, joining us today.
Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for joining us on Flock Talk.
Thanks so much, Erin and Jordan, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Why don't you start off by giving us an overview? Well, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you into the position at Farmers for Climate Solution, and tell us a little bit about the organization.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll work backwards. I'll start with the organization and get a little get into my own story later. But Farmers for Climate Solutions is a national farmer and rancher-led coalition. We have 29 member organizations, which includes Ontario sheep farmers. Our main work is advancing policy and on-farm solutions to support producers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience on farm. In our policy work since 2020, we've advanced policy proposals with the help of and support of our members and other collaborators that have resulted in a total of about $1.5 billion in federal investment into the sector. Wow. In our programming work, our on-farm solutions work, we're just embarking on the fourth year of our Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. We call it the FARM program for short. And that program offers free peer-to-peer mentorship, training, and networking to 10,000 producers across the country to help them adopt low emissions, high resilience practices on their farms, such as cover cropping, advanced nitrogen management, and rotational grazing. And recently, we've also begun taking on select strategic initiatives, kind of one-time projects that we hope sort of innovate in important ways in the sector to advance our work. So that's FCS in a nutshell. I became involved with the organization because I was a farmer. I had been a vegetable farmer for 15 years, mostly in British Columbia. And as soon as FCS began, I started following their work. I've always been really concerned about climate change. But the kind of turning point of what really got me involved was in 2021 in BC. We had several severe weather events. The first one being the heat dome in the summer, which was just a bubble, a high pressure system that just lingered over the province. It was so hot, and it was a very frightening experience as a farmer. You had berry farmers with berries kind of frying on the bushes. Me as a vegetable farmer, we normally have pretty dry, droughty summers, so we have to be really careful with water. Mm-hmm. And we had a pond on our farm that we use for irrigation, and you kind of have to build your operation around water availability, especially when it comes to vegetables, right? And we had a certain amount of water that we knew we had to work with. And during the heat dome, there were just several days back to back where I pre-irrigated before the heat dome, seeing the temperatures come. What was coming in the forecast, and then when they hit, it was so stifling, and we had tons of crops at different stages of development, including just seeded, that it was either don't irrigate them and lose them, or irrigate the heck out of them to try and kind of create a microclimate to cool them. But this was days and days of doing this. Everything about it felt so wrong. Exactly when you shouldn't be irrigating. Wow. We had to irrigate the most. Of course, I was staying up late at night and early in the morning to do the irrigation at those times, but we ran through so much of our water, which had never happened before, that the end of the season, we lost a lot at the end of the season as a result. That was a frightening experience. And just thinking that is going to be happening more and more often for farmers, and everybody suffered in different ways. And then, of course, later that year, we had the atmospheric river, which flooded Abbotsford and washed out a bunch of highways and things like that. And just thinking like this farmers can't remain viable in these kinds of conditions. And that is what really spurred me to get involved. And it just so happened that Farmers for Climate Solutions was hiring at that time, and I applied, and the rest is history. So wow. This year I'm in the ED position because our ED is on parental leave, but normally I'm the director of our Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. So
wow.
Great. Well, it is certainly alarming how many once in a lifetime weather events we're seeing every year these days. So, Andrew, how do you see that the role of farmers, and particularly sheep farmers, in the fight against climate change?
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, at the core of all our work in FCS is the idea that we put farmers in leadership positions. So this is from our board of directors, which includes actually one of your board members, Wesley Godden, to our staff, which includes one of your Ontario sheep members, Brenda Shway. to our working groups and advisory bodies, which I can explain later. So, our membership is made up of organizations and farmers who want to help find climate solutions, and who are ready to do so, who think that farmers and ranchers and graziers have some solutions at their fingertips already. The reality is every farmer has to kind of define for themselves what they can contribute to this fight. All farmers face some serious potential barriers, right, to kind of picking up the fight, not the least of which are economic for most folks, obviously. But for those farmers who are interested and able, there are so many ways that you can get involved. Probably most readily at hand is trying to adopt certain practices or on-farm solutions. And for sheep farmers in particular, rotational grazing is the one that comes to mind. This is a great way for anybody to do something tangible to sequester more carbon in their soils. I'm sure most of your listeners are aware that if you are taking on rotational grazing and you're doing it on new acres, or you're ramping up, then you can take advantage of programs that exist like the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, which is a federal incentive funding program. Producers can take biodiversity measures on their farm, which will also have greenhouse gas reduction benefits. Preserving trees and wetlands. I know wetlands are a contentious topic in Ontario, so all the caveats apply, right? Where you can, where you're able with your particular operation. And then, of course, I assume there are many sheep farmers in Ontario who are also growing crops. And so you can adopt practices like cover cropping, or you can manage your nitrogen more effectively to reduce leaks that result in nitrous oxide emissions. But I'd say so those are that's just sort of a grab bag of on-farm practices that we're working with, that we would work with sheep farmers to support them to implement. But equally important, I would say, would be the less tangible things that people can do, like engaging with your commodity groups, governments, and even just your neighbors to just talk about the issue and raise its profile. There's a lot of reasons that people don't talk about climate change. It's a real downer, first of all. There's a lot of divisiveness around the issue, second of all. But talking is one of the most powerful things that we can do, especially if you strongly believe that we need to fight climate change. Talk to your families and neighbors about it. We know that farmers especially most trust their neighbors and their community members with new information, with new ideas. Changing hearts and minds tends to happen person to person where there's a pre-existing relationship. So don't underestimate the value of just talking about it and meeting people where they're at on it. But then, of course, on another level, farmers can get involved in campaigns to lobby for more support from the government, which we do, but which a lot of other organizations do as well.
Amazing. So that's really great. Talking to each other, sharing ideas is fantastic. And then when it comes to specific challenges that farmers face when they are implementing climate friendly practices, are there supports that your organization has for those who are just starting on their journey?
For sure. So we do a bunch of surveys all the time through our farm program about what are the main barriers and challenges producers are facing to adopting some of these practices. And the top five we hear are shortages of labor, time, funding, or access to funding, or knowledge of where funding is. It's a big grab bag. Knowledge is number four, and expertise is number five, which is tied closely to knowledge. So I'm going to take them not in any particular order, but if we're talking about funding, our organization worked really hard with the government to get what is now the On-Farm Climate Action Fund program released. So that is work that we do to try to support farmers. We try to bring investment to the sector to support producers financially to adopt these practices, and we'll continue with those efforts. In terms of knowledge, that's where our farm program comes in. It's a knowledge transfer program. It's a peer-to-peer, extension knowledge transfer mentorship program. So we support farmers through that program. I can talk more about the specifics of it later. And in terms of expertise, I'll give a little teaser that the next phase of our program is going to have a significant element added to boost extension capacity across the country in these BMP areas that we work in. And so training agronomists, working with agronomists, and working with their certifying bodies, agronomists and CCAs for that matter, to kind of build up their expertise so that they can offer that out to producers. The other two, labor and time, shortages of labor and time, those are trickier for us. And at this point in time, we sort of consider it out of scope for us to support farmers with, because there's just so many factors there that are out of our control. But I would say that in general, the suite of practices that we support farmers to implement were chosen in part because they bring other important co-benefits to the farm, whether those are ecological, agronomic benefits. For some, there's even lifestyle benefits. But the goal is to get producers to rethink their operations, not just one practice at a time, ideally, but as a kind of complete system. And our hope is that if we can support farmers in doing that well, it results in some efficiencies gained that may or may not, in lots of cases, ease the shortages of labor and time.
Amazing.
Hmm. Andrew, would you be able to share some success stories or examples of how farmers have successfully integrated climate solutions into their operations?
For sure. Yeah. We hear lots of stories through our farm program because we work with so many different producers, both the mentors and the farmers who are working with the mentors, and it's lots of fun to kind of see the different examples. We also tour around a lot. This summer we were just in Ontario and Quebec, as I was saying before we started the interview here, about just visiting a lot of different farms, and that's always really eye-opening. But we have graziers within the program. If I start with graziers, who've adopted or intensified the rotational grazing practice, and they've seen big improvements in forage quality and animal health. Some of them, it's allowed them to kind of up their stocking densities, which economically is a boost, obviously. Um, they can have animals on their pasture for more of the year, so they can buy in less feed. They see better regrowth in their pastures, and over the long term, lots of them are reporting, soil building in their pastures, which of course points to increased carbon sequestration. We also have lots of folks who come to us, cover croppers who have seen big jumps in soil health and soil fertility. There's one farmer in particular in Saskatchewan who farms 12,000 acres, so it's not a small farm. If he's at the point where in his cover cropping program where he opts out of crop insurance because it's not worth paying the premiums anymore. And when we were on visiting his farm 2 summers ago, he dug up part of the field in that had been cover cropped by him for quite a few years. And another field right beside that same soil type that he bought from a neighbor recently that had been farmed using different methods, certainly not cover cropping. And he was kind of showing us the difference in soil texture between the two fields side by side. And it was a revelation when you looked at the soil structure, and then the way he cover crops. He also has a compost program on farm, so that adds some fertility. But you see the difference in soil structure. It's a very dry area in southern Saskatchewan. His water retention capacity is greatly increased. His nutrient retention capacity is greatly increased to the point where on 12,000 acres, he averaged out over those acres, he applies about 20% the amount of nitrogen that most of his neighbors do. So
Wow.
that's not 20% less nitrogen. That's 80% less nitrogen,
Wow.
which is striking. And his crops are beautiful and healthy. He's got an amazing story to tell. And now that's someone. I don't want to tell that story too flippantly. He's probably an outlier, and he's done that for years and years and years before we came along. But it sort of speaks to what the right set of practices in the right setting can do. What I would encourage everyone to do is start small. If you're going to experiment and you're looking for success in implementation, experiment in small strips. Find someone experienced to work with. Use the resources that we or other organizations offer to kind of help. You're learning through this, and once you build some confidence and you're confident you can mitigate some of the risks, then yeah, expand as it works.
Yeah, that sort of leads to so many things. The question that I have next for you is how you work with policymakers to, share these success stories and speak on behalf of farmers. But also, I'm wondering, like, have you captured these results quantitatively anywhere? I'm thinking about, a research project that we have currently going on comparing sort of grazed fields to fields that aren't grazed to try and get some data about the
Mhm.
value of grazing and the value of cover crops to subsequent corn yields is what we're looking at. But I'm just wondering, like, when you're talking to policymakers, do you have some of this data captured quantitatively?
Um, yes and no. We have a lot of data that goes into our policy proposals. The what is lacking, generally speaking, across the board in Canada right now is on-farm data.
Mm.
On-farm data linked to specific practice changes. It's either cost prohibitive to collect at a large scale, or it's very difficult, right? We're talking about in agriculture, we're talking about three different greenhouse gases: methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide, that are emitted at just under 200,000 different individual points,
Yeah.
each farm, in a highly complex biological system where there's a lot of variability. And so there remain significant challenges to collecting reliable on farm data. And that said, there's a host of studies out there that can be sort of aggregated and used to feed into models and sort of predictions that point to, if there were certain practices adopted at scale, what scale would they have to be adopted at, and what would be the cost and the likely emissions reduction as a result of that adoption. So most of our wanted, like we don't currently collect on-farm data. It's something that we're looking into, and we're working with other partners and stakeholders to try and sort of sort out a solution to, but it's probably much larger than us. And it certainly requires either government or private support or both. But we are working on those fronts. And what we do have is, when you're talking about how we work with policymakers to put forward policy solutions and how we do that with farmers, maybe I'll just dive right into
Yeah, please.
that part of the question, because it sort of answers a little bit how we do use the data we have right now as well. Right now, when we put forward policy proposals, a main way we do this is we pull together task forces. And these are farmer-led task forces. Farmer-led meaning farmers are chairing these task forces that are otherwise made up of experts, academics, who, they may be emissions experts, they may be ag economics experts, they may be energy experts, social and behavior experts. But what we do is we pull together these task forces to create fully costed recommendations to give to policymakers, and to make the case for programming to support suites of practices that are relatively low cost for both farmers and governments to implement, and relatively high impact in terms of emissions reductions. Our recommendations have also been built around practices like in the On-Farm Climate Action Fund program that already exist, for which there is knowledge out there, and that we have a chance of kind of spreading widely because lots of farmers are already using them. So those task forces take kind of leading scientists and academics in the country to gather together the most up-to-date scientific information. And we have, I'll point your listeners towards on our website, in our sort of policy solutions page, we've got our reports, which are very sort of plain language and easy to understand. But there's kind of fine print hyperlinks at the bottom of those reports that include the very detailed and very technical emissions and economics reports that feed into those recommendations. And that's all, those contain all that scientific data that the experts have pulled together to kind of look at various scenarios of adoption at scale, what it looks like, what the mitigation potential is from an emissions perspective, and how much it costs, what the abatement cost is per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's kind of the data question. Moving to how we sort of involve farmers in that. Like I said, those are farmer-led task forces, but we also have a policy working group, which is essentially made up of representatives from some of our member organizations that weigh in pretty significantly on the creation of those reports and what goes into them. We have other ways we work with policymakers too, and involve farmers in working with policymakers. In February this year, for example, we just had a lobby day on Parliament Hill with our staff and our board members, at least half of whom are producers. We met with 30 government officials from all major political parties and a whole bunch of civil servants and senators to encourage the release of the sustainable agriculture strategy, which the current government is writing right now to try and sort of coordinate and bring coherence to sustainability programming in agriculture across the country, but also would ultimately bring significant new investment to support producers in the implementation of sustainable practices on farm. The presence of producers in those meetings is invaluable. Government officials, in our experience, are really thirsty to hear directly from farmers. So we're in constant dialogue with policymakers about emergent issues in the sector or initiatives like the Sustainable Agriculture Strategy. And one last point I guess I'd leave you with on how we involve producers in and trying to bring them to policymakers per se is this past year, we launched a strategic initiative called the Prairie Farmer and Rancher Forum. So this was based in the Prairie provinces, brought together 36 randomly selected farmers and ranchers from the prairies for 3 long meetings. They were 3-day meetings each, so 9 days of meetings, one in each Prairie province, to come up with recommendations to ensure the sustainability of their sector into the future. So we intentionally selected for people who had a wide range of views on climate change in particular, from outright denial to this is the most important existential crisis humanity faces and everything in between. To get people into the room, to listen to one another, this was also a listening exercise for us to understand better where the full sweep of producers are on the prairies on this issue. And it was a highly enlightening experience on a number of levels, not the least of which was we realized that after the first meeting, it became very clear we were not going to agree in the room on the problem. We just weren't going to convince one another one way or another of what climate change was, whether it was human caused, but we could agree on solutions despite not agreeing on the problems. So that group came up with an impressive list of 35 recommendations. And our commitment, FCS's commitment, besides leading that process, was to take those recommendations to various policymakers and thread them into our work in the future. So
Wow, that's interesting. I would love to do that in Ontario. Any plans to come east?
yes, not. I can't say there's definite plans, but we've had lots of expressions of interest and questions about whether we'll repeat this process in Ontario, specifically in Ontario, including from the funders who funded this initiative. So I think there's a decent likelihood that we'll do something similar. I can't say it'll be the exact same thing, but we're certainly considering it, and I think we would consider doing something similar in Ontario, but perhaps with a more specific policy outcome in mind. This first one was a very wide open discussion, and that yielded some really useful insights. But I think it could be even more impactful if we could apply it towards a specific policy initiative. So we're definitely playing with that idea. Yeah.
Amazing. I bet your facilitators are amazing if you got 35
Yes.
recommendations from that wide viewpoint.
They were amazing. We hired a dynamic team from the prairies, based in the prairies, to facilitate those meetings. So they were great.
Wow.
Andrew, can you speak to the resources or programs that FCS has that helps farmers transition to more sustainable practices while maintaining their profitability on the farm?
Yeah, for sure. The main one is our farm program, our Farm Resilience Mentorship Program, and the associated Farm Learning Hub. The website address for that is just farmlearninghub, all one word, .ca. So that program involves, there's sort of 3 main ways that farmers can tap into that program to sort of build their knowledge around the 3 BMP areas that I mentioned at the top. One main way is they can attend events that are organized by our partners. So we deliver this program through partners all across the country. In Ontario, it's delivered by this year by the Ontario Soil Network, by the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, and by the Ontario Forage Council. So all those organizations are running events all year long, and the events are different depending on the organization, as are the focus or the foci of those events. But all those events are listed on our partner pages likely, and they're definitely listed on our Farm Learning Hub as well. If your listeners log on to the Farm Learning Hub, well, let me say, so events first, jumping ahead. Networking opportunities, which is just another kind of event, but lots of our partners organize sort of ongoing discussion series, or in the case of, say, the Ontario Forage Council, they do a series of pasture walks, which might be of interest to sheep farmers if they're doing some sheep-focused ones. Then the third way that producers can plug into this program is we have this online learning hub, the farmlearninghub.ca. And on the Farm Learning Hub, you'll see it's organized by province. So you click into your province. It's free as well. So there's no registration fee or anything like that. You just have to put in your email. And then you can get access to a listing of events that are coming up in your region, which we keep up to date all the time. And they run all year long, depending on the partner. And then there's also a significant store of resources. So we've worked with curriculum developers across the country in each of those BMP areas to create very extensive resources in these areas to help producers, say, go through some kind of self-study or just try to narrow in on a problem they're facing and try to get the answer to that problem on their own time when they have the time. And I should say, we're just about to overhaul that hub to be more user-friendly, to be more searchable and filterable by topic. And we're also just about to integrate some decision support tools, some calculators, and things like that. So, if you log on there now, it'll look different in a few months. And so check back in a few months and stay tuned because there's lots of great resources there. So that's the main thing, the farm program in terms of resources for farmers and helping them transition into implementing these practices while maintaining profitability. I will give a little teaser to say stay tuned because we're just gotten confirmation that we're launching phase 1 of a new project, which is a BMP insurance program. So this project is going to be built out in 3 phases. The first phase is just research and a feasibility study, which will lead into phase 2, which is a very small scale pilot to look at piloting one crop, one region, and one practice to be eligible for BMP insurance. So the idea here is we're trying to de-risk the adoption of these practices for producers by offering a very affordable insurance product that would pay out in the event of a reduction in yield as a result of adopting the practice. But of course, the program would be designed so that the payout is hopefully unlikely, that the return on investment for the producer is hopefully fairly well guaranteed. But it hopefully gets producers over the hump of that first 3 to 5 years, where sometimes there can be more risk in adopting a new practice until you kind of figure out your system. So these are pilots that we're doing. The third phase is just a larger pilot, but that's something that's coming up that we hope will grow into a support for producers in the long run. And then I'd also say we don't directly offer these supports, but of course our advocacy has led to, again, programs like the On-Farm Climate Action Fund or the Resilient Agricultural Lands Program, which offers supports to producers adopting various BMPs or setting land aside, those kinds of things.
Interesting. Well, you've talked about a lot of things that are ongoing and a teaser about one pilot coming up. Is there anything else that our producers need to be aware of that's on the horizon for Farmers for Climate Solutions?
Yeah, let's see. We may have pulled back the curtain on most of them. Keep an eye out for ongoing farm programs in Ontario, but also not just farm program events, but OSCIA of course is delivering the off-CAF program. So keep an eye out because they'll have many KTT events or knowledge transfer events that are relevant to sheep producers as well. Not just the incentive payment. I would say in the second phase of the farm program, which we are going to launch in, let's just say later 2025, so about a year from now, we're also going to be integrating more beneficial management practices than the ones that currently exist in the program, including some biodiversity BMPs. Perhaps some support with things like profitability mapping to identify for croppers. But again, I assume there are croppers in your in your numbers. So, but profitability mapping to identify those corners of the field that you may be losing money on, that you may save more money by putting it back into perennial cover somehow. So that's one thing we're thinking about integrating. I'll say what's coming up in the fall of 2024 is our current task force, our current policy task force is working on low emission pathways for agriculture to 2050. And we should have a first report from that task force in the fall. Then there's going to be a whole second phase of that task force that will go into more detail. But this is really just to kind of identify the list of most promising practices to 2050, which is sort of going to be a whole new ball of wax and a little bit different from getting to 2030. Anyway, there will be more practices in there that we try to construct these reports so that there's a menu of options where there's going to be something that everyone can work with. Not everyone will do everything, but besides the very potential kind of forum in Ontario, like the Prairie Farm and Rancher Forum and the BMP insurance pilot, those would be the main ones coming up.
Amazing.
Andrew, is there anything you haven't already touched upon on the role of that technology has to play of helping farmers adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's no question that technology has a role to play. Whether it's the potential of a product like 3-NOP to reduce methane emissions in cattle, or looking for grain dryer fuel alternatives, which my understanding is commercially these currently don't exist really that are viable. But this year we met one Ontario farmer. We did a tour of his farm. It was amazing. Who just bought, I believe it's 120 horsepower electric tractor from the EU. So these are really interesting, compelling possible solutions to pieces of the climate change problem in agriculture. But I think we also have to tread a little bit cautiously where technological solutions are concerned. Many of those solutions are either far off in time, like they haven't been conceived of yet, and they may not be, we just don't know, or they haven't been approved yet by regulators in Canada, or they're out of reach financially, which is probably the biggest barrier for a lot of them at this point. But maybe more importantly is that many, if not most, of the technological solutions we can imagine also will certainly have other unintended consequences that create other problems for us down the road. I kind of think of it like a game of whack-a-mole in a certain way. You solve one thing, but another thing comes up, and we're kind of stuck in this cycle of playing that game of whack-a-mole. So again, there is definitely a place for technological solutions, but they have to be really carefully thought out, and their unintended consequences hopefully have to be thought of and mitigated against. But for now, for Farmers for Climate Solutions, and that task force to 2050, those low emissions pathways to 2050 are definitely considering technological solutions as potential pathways. But for now, heading to 2030, what we've been focused on is simpler, more cost-effective, more ready at hand biological solutions that we can use as farmers and ranchers to mitigate climate change. And there's sort of less in the way between us and those solutions right now. And there's also less potential for things to go awry. So that's the sort of cautious approach that we are taking right now. But again, yeah, there's definitely a place for technological solutions.
So that's leading me to our final question, Andrew, where I am wondering about the bigger picture, the potential, whether or not it's even possible to mitigate these environmental challenges. How does Farmers for Climate Solutions feel about the future when you're looking at creating long-term goals, when you're, creating your organization, when you're talking about the future, and you're developing all of these sort of shorter term goals? How do you feel about the future? Is it possible to affect climate change?
There are definitely solutions. There are definitely promising trends we're seeing. There are definitely precedents in other countries that we can follow that are working really well. All the investment in the US that's happening. There's some amazing initiatives in Australia, other initiatives in the EU, some of which have caused lots of problems, like with the big protests we saw in the EU this summer, because in large part were because regulations were being adopted that farmers didn't feel adequately consulted on. And we are watching that really closely. And a lot of our work has to do with listening first, figuring out what producers in the sector are identifying as problems, as gaps, as needs, and then responding to those needs rather than a more top-down approach. And when we're trying to bring government along with that approach, right? Like, don't just impose something that's going to backfire. Consult widely in the sector. If you can't do it, we're going to try to do it and bring those consultations to you. But you really need to do it, government, as well. You need to have farmers at the table. This has been a main part of all of the ways we've approached policy making, whether with our task forces or whether with the sustainable agriculture strategy, kind of drafting. Lots of organizations have been around that table, and FCS has been a constant voice saying, bring in more, bring in more. So it is possible to reduce emissions in agriculture, to kind of do our part. Whether it's possible to, say, for example, achieve net zero by 2050 in agriculture in Canada, nobody actually knows. It's going to be very difficult. What we know for certain is that each year that goes by where we don't do something, it means we have to do more and more in each subsequent year to close the gap. But what we also know is that with 100% certainty is that the cost of inaction now, or the cost of delayed action, is going to be far greater than the cost of any action that we take. And the sooner the better, really. and we're already seeing a lot of those costs. Crop insurance payouts have gone through the roof in past years. You take any sort of major, people call them natural disasters. You could otherwise characterize them as unnatural disasters that are happening with more frequency and severity, that are causing huge amounts of cost to be put into rebuilding and repairing. The more we can do to avoid those events, the more money we will all save in the long run. So that's our approach. And it's really important for Farmers for Climate Solutions. We work really hard on mitigation, and we also with a very clear-eyed approach, have to acknowledge the realities that farmers face, right? So many farmers have off-farm jobs to make their farm work. Financial stress is a huge reality in farming. We can't ask farmers just to take on additional risk for the public good without additional support. And that's our whole approach, right? We need farmers. Many farmers are willing and able to implement solutions, but we need support to do that. We need government support financially, but then we also need the support, those 5 things: labor, time, knowledge, expertise, funding. All those things are needed. So, but I think we can do that. We can make huge strides if we work together to do that, for sure.
I like that ending.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, collaboration's key.
Some sobering thoughts to leave us with, but overall optimistic, I think.
Overall optimistic for sure. Yeah. The we're just finalizing our strategic plan till 2030, and I can't give too many detailed teasers about that, but it makes me excited to think about the work we have ahead of us and the potential we have within our sector to make a change. We definitely have some significant obstacles to overcome, and not the least of which, and we haven't talked about that yet today, is misinformation and disinformation about climate change, about several things, in the sector or in general. But our Farmers for Climate Solutions approach is to be a bridging voice, to find the common ground rather than the things that divide us, because it's a bit of a trope or a cliche, but it's absolutely true. And we learned this through the Prairie Farmer and Rancher Forum. Again, we have so much more in common than we have not.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
And even when we can't agree on the problem, we can agree on lots of solutions and lots of things that we all care about, that we can work on together, that will also have a positive climate benefit.
Well, I feel so much better knowing that there is an organization focused on climate solutions and that we are partnered with them. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew, and sharing all your insights.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much for the great questions, and thanks for participating in our work as Ontario sheep farmers and doing the good work you do.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to Wesley for volunteering on your board. He's a really great resource for us and yourself.
Yeah, he is a great resource and just a lovely human being.
Yes, agreed. And thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Join us next Wednesday for a very special interview with Agriculture Minister Rob Flack, the newly appointed Ontario Minister of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness.
Join us for the Ultimate Ontario Sheep Convention and AGM on October 25th and 26th, 2024 at the Cambridge Hotel Conference Centre. This year's theme is Unlocking Profit Potential, and we've got a new format. The AGM kicks off Friday afternoon, followed by a banquet that evening. The convention continues Saturday with keynote speaker Dr. Mark Ferguson from NextGen Agri, and we'll have 2 satellite locations this year in Eastern Ontario and Northern Ontario. Register by October 2nd for early bird pricing. Don't miss out. Visit ontariosheep.org/2024 AGM to secure your spot. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe through your podcast app to receive alerts for future episodes, and please consider sharing this podcast with your friends.
For more Ontario Sheep Farmers content, follow us on social media at Ontario Sheep Farmers on Instagram and Facebook, at Ontario Sheep Farmers on X, and visit our website at ontariosheep.org.